Today is March 2nd, 2006. We are at the Warhawk Museum in Napa, Idaho. We are fortunate enough to be able to interview Virginia McCutcheon as part of the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Library of Congress. My name is Tim Peterson. I will be conducting the interview. Also in the room is the camera operator, Roger Williams. Virginia, can you tell us your full name?
Virginia Bacchus Webb McCutcheon.
And you were known as Webb in the service?
I was Jenny Webb the whole time I was in the Navy.
Jenny Webb. So we'll call you Jenny throughout the interview?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, very good. And your full address?
3415 Hawthorne Drive, Boise, Idaho, 83703.
Very good. And your date of birth?
November 10th, 1921.
And what branch of the military did you serve in?
I joined the U.S. Navy, the Waves.
In?
1944.
1944. Very good. Thank you. Jenny, where were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And did you grow up in Philadelphia?
Yes, I did.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I have one brother who is younger than I am. He was a Navy pilot in World War II.
And did you graduate from high school?
Oh yes, I graduated from Germantown High School in Philadelphia.
Germantown.
In 1939.
Did you grow up speaking German?
Oh no. My family were Germans. My maiden name was Bacchus. We were one of 13 families that came over with Francis Daniel Pastorius, who founded Germantown, Philadelphia. And they have, in high school, one of the teachers said, did I know that my name was on a big statue down in the local park? But anyhow, my family had been there for quite a few years. Back in the 1700s, they came over from Germany. But yes, I grew up in Philadelphia. And when I first went in the Navy in New England, everybody made fun of me because I said coffee and talk. You know, that's how they talked back in this. So with all the New Englanders, I pretty soon got over that. Yeah.
Yeah, you lost that accent. And did you go on to college?
No, I didn't. I had learned to fly when I was 19. When I got out of high school, I'd saved my money. I worked in John Wanamaker's, which was a big department store in Philadelphia, and then I worked at my aunt's bookstore. And I was saving my money to learn to fly. And so I finally got enough, $64 saved for the first 8 hours. And I was dating a fellow that would let me have his car from Tuesday night until Wednesday night. So when I got off, I had the afternoon off, Wednesday afternoon off from the bookstore, I would drive up to the airport. And I took a half-hour instruction a week. That started in June 1941. I was 19, and so I learned to fly. And so in November of 1941, November 18th, I soloed. I had 9 hours and 15 minutes instruction, and my instructor said, well, I think you find the plane takes off a lot faster without me in it. And so I took off, circled the field, and came in and landed, and I was very excited. Well, then the next week it rained, and so we didn't fly. We just sat in the hangar and talked. And then the following week was Pearl Harbor, and in Philadelphia, everything was grounded 100 miles in from the coast because we had so many German subs out there. And so then I joined the Civil Air Patrol. You all needed a birth certificate, and Harrisburg was pretty busy trying to get out birth certificates. It took 6 months to get a birth certificate. In the meantime, when everything was grounded, I joined the Civil Air Patrol, and pretty soon everything was grounded 150 miles in, and then you couldn't get the gas, and it was just one big thing. And so this fellow I was going with wanted to get married, so I thought, well, I'll get married till the war's over, whatever. So we got married, and then he got drafted in February of 1944, and the day after he got drafted, I went downtown Philadelphia and joined the Waves. So I went to boot camp at Hunter College, the Bronx, New York, and that was a 6-week course, and So then the wave officers, we had tests, we studied naval history, all that kind of thing. And so they interviewed us about the 5th weekend and said, well, my grades were good enough to go to storekeeper school or yeoman school. And I said, oh, I don't want either one of those things. And the very nerve of talking like that to a wave officer was something. But anyhow, I did. And so she said, well, what do you want? I said, something to do with aviation. And then I told her I had learned to fly, and I had taken all these correspondence courses on meteorology and aerodynamics, all kinds of things. And so she sent me on a direct assignment to Quonset Point, Rhode Island, which is a big naval air station. So I got up there and had more classes. I had 6 weeks of classes, and one of the classes was recognition. They would flash the planes on a screen 1/5 of a second. You had to identify them. Well, I got 4.0 in recognition. And so the wave officer says, well, we're going to send you right to the tower. So that's how I got to the tower, and I'm thrilled to death with it. So it was very, no 2 days were alike working in the tower. We only worked 4-hour watches at a time. And sometimes it'd be from midnight till 4 o'clock in the morning, and if there wasn't any flying, we'd sit on the floor and play bridge or something like that. But it was a very, very exciting job. Like I say, no 2 days were alike. And we had a lot of VIP coming in, generals, and the Newport War College was right across the bay. And so then in December of that year, I got sent to Groton, Connecticut, which was an outlying field. It was NAAS, Naval Auxiliary Air Station at Groton, Connecticut, which is right outside of New London. And there were 10 of us waves there, and we had one wave officer, and she lived in the barracks with us. Well, I didn't work in the tower there. I worked in operations where the pilots come in and file their flight plans. And then I was quartermaster of the charts, the flight charts that you had to put 2 dots, they changed the call and things. But anyhow, it was one of the things that happened while I was at Groton. One day, well, a lot of admirals came in, but one day, Admiral John S. McCain flew in, and we were all standing at attention, very stiff and straight. I was all of a seaman first. And he came over to me and he said, honey, can I use your telephone? I'd like to die. And I said, yes, sir. And I put the phone over on the counter for him. And he called his son, who was a commander on a submarine at New London. And Senator John S. McCain is the son of the one who was in the submarines. And the admiral was John S. McCain, the senator's grandfather. And you know, I thought at the time, you know, what's everybody so scared about? This is just a nice old guy. And so anyhow, years and years later, when I was stationed at NAS San Diego, as I drove in, I had a brand new car I'd bought, and as I drove in the gate, right in front of me here is this big monument to Admiral John S. McCain. I thought, wow, that was the old admiral that said, honey, can I use your telephone? But anyhow, getting back to Quonset and Groton, being from Philadelphia, I was always, every once a month, I got a long weekend from Friday noon till Monday noon. And I usually got a hop home. And I got hops in all kinds of airplanes, B-24s, you name it, all kinds of things. And the hop in the B-24 was kind of funny because it had just come back from Europe, had 53 missions on it, and they were referring it to Corpus Christi for overhaul. And how to get in it, you kind of walked along, then crouched, and then you stood up and you were inside the plane. So there was the pilot and co-pilot, and I was absolutely amazed at all these throttles, 16 throttles there to push. But anyhow, and the radio man was there. So we landed in Harrisburg, Middleton Air Force Base, and the nose wheel wouldn't come down. So we circled and circled and circled and circled, and they told me they were going to hold me by my feet and make me poke at it. But anyhow, we finally landed, and So then it took me twice as long by train to get to Philadelphia as it did to fly all the way from Quonset or Groton, Connecticut. But anyhow, so those kind of things I thought were very, very interesting, very exciting. I couldn't be doing that if I was a civilian, you know. And like I say, and then when the war was over, I got sent back up to Quonset, which was a big air station. We closed Groton up. And all these charts I had worked on for so long, put dots and all that to change the, the identification. We had to take out, I had a Navy license, driver's license, so I had to drive this Jeep out to the dump and burn all these charts. And but anyhow, we closed Groton up, and then Groton was quite a base. New London was the town, and there was the sub base and the Maritime Academy and the air station. I mean, you could have had 6 dates a night. You know, there were so many guys there. But anyhow, we didn't do things like that. But at Groton, and one of the squadrons was this pilot that I met, and he dated my friend, and I dated his friend. And oh, did I have a crush on him. So anyhow, that was in '45. Well, but the war is over. I was stationed back at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. And I worked in the tower. And the worst thing that ever happened while I was on duty in the tower is a Sunday morning. And I heard this frantic Navy Quonset Tower, and he said his bureau number, and I said, this Navy Quonset Tower. Anyhow, he said he just lost his co-pilot. He was in an SNB, which is a little twin-engine Beechcraft, and as it say again, he's just lost his pilot. Well, it seems that his co-pilot had decided to commit suicide and went out the door and went into the water down Long Island Harbor, whatever. But anyhow, so I had to call the duty officer, and they had the crash people out there, and the PBY, the crash plane, went out and looked and searched, and they finally did find the body. But it was pretty unnerving to have something like that happen. And then, of course, we always had those Corsairs, the F-4Us, had 14 feet of nose. And pilots really had a zigzag taxiing because they couldn't see straight ahead. And I don't know, it seems after they got on the ground, they turned the radios off. And we would be telling to be aware of whatever was on the runway. They're always, Quonset Point was a filled-in area. So they were always checking for how deep down before they hit water. And anyhow, we had advised the planes to observe trucks on the runway, and they didn't pay any attention, you know. Then they get too close and then do a big nose up, you know. And so it was things like that. And then one day we had I guess it was a JD came in. It was like a B-26 came in, and they the landing gear, let's see, the nose wheel wouldn't come down. So they circled and circled and circled, and finally crashed. People went out and foamed the whole runway, and then they came in and landed, and they just kind of skidded in the foam, and everything was okay. Nobody got hurt. But we had a lot of exciting times, planes would take off and you never hear from them again. And I remember one time we had got this phone call, and it was somebody who's calling that said this TBM had just buzzed their field, their hometown. That was it. And so they said that had a big, I forget now what it was, but they gave the markings, the letter that was on the tail of the plane, and I knew then it was one of our planes. So I called the squadron to tell them that a TBM had just been reported flying very low over this town down in Pennsylvania. And so I had the name of the pilot right there on the log, and I asked the squadron person that answered, I said, "Where is that so-and-so fella from?" And they said, and it was the same town that got buzzed. So then I said, well, his plane just was buzzing, which is illegal. And I felt kind of guilty. ratting on the guy, but that's how it was. But anyhow, it was a lot of, no 2 days were the same working in the tower. It was a very exciting job. And then the wave who was in charge of operations, where the pilots filed their flight plans, she got out of the Navy and they needed somebody to take over her job. So I said, okay, they asked me if I would do it, and I said, yeah, that'd be fine. I had made first class, and and I had shipped over a couple more times, and but anyhow, so I was in charge of the operations dispatch. It's where the pilots filed their flight plans, and that was a very interesting job too. You got to see, it was where all the admirals and the generals, you know, after the war was over, they all went to over the War College for big conferences, whatever, and they would fly into Quonset, was the big air station there, so then go over to Newport, Rhode Island in the crash boat. I got to know Secretary Forrestal's pilot very well. Secretary Forrestal was the Secretary of the Navy, and he used to come in about twice a month, and I got to know his pilot. He'd sit around and wait for the crash boat to bring Forrestal back to Quonset, and then go out and start the plane up. And I had a lot of really fun experiences and things that I was very happy to have happen.
Jenny, I want to go back just a second. You said that you learned to fly at the age 19.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody in your family interested in aviation, or what sparked your interest in learning to fly?
I don't know. It was something that I remember my brother and I, he's 3 years younger than I am, when we were just, 10, 12 years old, something like that, we were talking about what we wanted to do when we grew up. And he said, well, he'd like to fly. And I said, yeah, I would too. And so I was older than he was. And in fact, he was still in high school when I was taking flying lessons. So the day I soloed, I drove over, you know, I was crazy. Mm-hmm. And nobody ever thought I'd do it, you know. Mm-hmm.
And how were you received in the aviation community?
Well, I wasn't in the aviation community.
Learning to fly.
Well, this was at Somerton Airport, which was, there weren't any other women pilots. There were men, you know.
And so that's what I mean. How were you received by?
Well, I just went up there and took a half-hour instruction once a week. Mm-hmm. And I scared the wits out of the instructor one day when I'm sitting in the back of this Piper Cub, and he said, do you know how to do a side slip? And I didn't say yes or no, I just did one. A week, like that. He said, don't ever do that again. So I said, well, that's good. I found out. But anyhow, yeah, I read, in high school, all I read was aviation magazines, and all I thought about was flying, flying, flying. And so then, like I say, the Japs kind of saved my life. I'd have probably killed myself at the rate I was going. And Pearl Harbor came along. I soloed November 18th, and then December 7th was 2 weeks later, and that was the end of the flying. And then you had to have a birth certificate, and then you could only go up as an observer, you know, and we'd go up, and I was in the Civil Air Patrol, and we'd go up and drop bags of flour on a big X down on the field, that kind of stuff. And so anyhow, then that got grounded, and there was a job in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, where they made Piper Cubs. And I had heard you could go out there and fly all you wanted, and all you had to do was pay for the gas. So I thought, well, I think I'll do that. Well, my father said, no, that's too far to go. Lock Haven, Pennsylvania. Good heavens, what are you thinking of? So I said that's when I got married. And so when he got drafted, boy, I just went in the Navy. And so when in 1946, he was in the Navy on a ship out in the Pacific, and he got out. And he called me and he said, when are you coming home? And I said, I'm not. I'm going to stay in the Navy. And I said, I'll get the divorce. You have no children, you know. I said, I just want to stay in the Navy. So that's what I did. And well, I was stationed there in Connecticut and then Rhode Island. And like I say, it was 6 years up there in New England. And I was having a lot of fun. It was, you know, people and pilots. I worked with pilots, talked with them. It was just a great life. They didn't hire women to do that kind of thing in civilian life, you know. And so when I shipped over and got sent to San Diego, when I got to San Diego, I went in, I reported in, and I got into operations, and they said, well, you might be an air controlman first class, but we don't allow waves to work in our tower. I said, oh, that's nice. And I said, well, I don't want to work anywhere I'm not wanted. So I worked in operations, again, where they filed the flight plans. And in San Diego, there was a lot of flights that went over to Hawaii and Guam and all those. So it was a whole different thing than what I had in New England. But I was just amazed at how many pilots that I knew back in New England were flying into San Diego and back and forth people. So anyhow, and then, like I said, I was there about a month when the Korean War started, and I was out with this helicopter pilot that I knew, and that's when I ran into Ted McCutcheon, and we were both pretty shocked to see each other because he thought I was in Jacksonville and I thought he was out in the Mediterranean. So then when he came back from Korea, that's when he said, well, why don't we get married? So about 3 or 4 months after that, I was in February when they got back, and I guess it was July when he came out. And he said, well, what do we do tonight? And I said, I thought we'd drive to Yuma. Oh, okay. See, in Yuma, you didn't need a marriage license or a blood test. So I had a car, so we drove to Yuma, and it was a pretty funny thing. We got there about 11:30 at night, and I said, well, I think I need a drink. So we went in a bar and had a drink. And we came out, it was the next day. See, it was after midnight. I said, okay, now it's 7:11, that's lucky. Because it was 7:10 when we got there. So, and then we found this little marriage chapel and knocked on the door at 12:30 that night, and the guy came out and told me we want to get married, and so he brought his wife out. She was in her bathrobe, and then they called this old guy in off the street. His name was Ezra or something, and so we got married, and we never even thought of a ring. So the guy comes out with a little box with 10-cent rings in it. So I picked one out, and we got married with that. And so then we drove back to San Diego, and he left the next day. And he was in test pilot training at Patuxent River, Maryland. And he had just come out with a class that was looking at the aircraft plants. So anyhow, it took me 3 months to get out of the Navy. And the thing was, I had shipped over 6 more years, and I'd only done about 1.5 years of that. And they were very hesitant to let me out. But my husband was stationed on the East Coast. I was stationed on the West Coast. He was a lieutenant commander. I was the first class enlisted. So they finally did let me out. And so then I drove back to Patuxent River, Maryland. And that was the start of 50 years, which I'm very proud of. Mm-hmm. And because we really didn't know each other that well, but I had a crush on him that wouldn't quit. So we had 14 moves in 17 years. He put in 27 years in the Navy, and so we had 17 years. I had 17 more years in the Navy, which I liked. Wow. We moved around quite a bit. Our kids were all born in different states.
Now, you brought in some photographs, and I'd like to go over some of these if we could. And the first one that I want to look at, you say this is a control tower?
Yes, that's a control tower.
You served in?
Yes, Quonset Point, Rhode Island.
Okay, now this is in Rhode Island.
And the cover is the outside, is the picture of the tower also.
And on the inside where we're looking at, we can actually see the tower, and we can see what the inside of what's commonly called the cab.
No, it was just the tower. It was just
the tower? We
yeah.
didn't call it the cab then? Okay. And what are the different positions within the tower?
Well, they had spotters, and then You had mic duty. They switched duties every time you had a duty, and we worked 4 hours at a time. And one of the duties was to give the weather for most of New England and the close areas on the radio range once an hour. We did that. And then when there was a hurricane coming, we had to put mattresses up against all the windows. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it was a very interesting place to work.
And I noticed that there's staircases in the tower. They didn't have an elevator back then.
No, around.
Yeah, that wouldn't fly today.
It wouldn't?
You know, you'd have to have an elevator because
Is that
of
right?
ADA, yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay. And then we have a photograph here of,
Boot camp,
this is boot camp.
Hunter College, New York.
And how many were there in your class in boot camp?
Well, there were 1,600 women there at the at the boot camp, and I don't remember how many was in their section. I think it's probably about 30 or 40 in the section. This is one of the whole bunches of them. They were coming and going. They got new. The classes lasted about 6 weeks, and so about every month or so, another group of women would come in.
Okay. And then this next photograph, this is a graduation?
No, that's an inspection, a Navy
It's an
inspection
Okay.
at Groton, Connecticut.
And let's show that, the inspection, but it shows this small group over here,
Our waves.
our waves.
We had 10 waves there.
So majority are men
Mhm.
with a small group of women.
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
But this was just the base personnel. There was the whole air group. We had a whole air group there, which made up was 4 squadrons, and they weren't included in our inspections. This is just the air station people
In Groton.
in Groton. Hmm.
Okay. And then you brought in, these are some F4Us?
F4Us. Hmm.
Okay. And tell us about these.
Well, that was from a squadron that was stationed at Groton, and they used to buzz the field every once. They'd have a group grope, which we all just loved because they'd dive down on the field, you know, all the squadrons.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the whole air group.
That's the whole level.
That's the torpedo bombers and the fighter planes, all of them. Hmm.
Okay, so quite a variety of different types
Oh
of
yes,
airplanes
hmm
that you handle.
they're all carrier
Yeah.
planes.
Okay. And then you're shaking hands with a gentleman here.
That's he was the operations officer at Quonset when I was leaving Quonset to hopefully get to Jacksonville, Florida, but they sent me to San Diego. So, and he was wishing me luck.
Okay.
They called me a plank owner because I'd been there for 6 years.
And this is
This is when I was stationed at San Diego, and there were 4 of us waves in a movie with William Bendix and William Holden, and it was called Submarine Command. That's the name of the movie.
And how did you get selected to be in this movie?
I don't know. Somebody just said, "You want to be in a movie?" Oh, okay. Yeah. But
Okay. And do you have a copy of that movie today?
no.
No? Do you remember seeing it?
Oh yes, it wasn't that big a deal. I don't know. It made you realize how phony movies are because William Holden would. I knew his lines as well as he did. You know, he was at a table right from me, and he'd come and sit and lean on the back of my chair, and then they kept saying, drink up, you know, we had some kind of tea or something, and smoke up, you know, and then we had to get up and dance, and we had these little slippers on our shoes so we didn't make any noise, and there was no music, you know, but dance, okay. And it was, like I say, we got to know William Holden's lines real well, and then we all had our pictures taken with William Bendix, and he was kind of a grouch. We had individual pictures taken with him, and he's sitting there smiling, and then he'd say, "How many more are there?" But anyhow,
Okay. Tell us about this photograph.
This was when I was stationed
I'm gonna turn that to the camera.
at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and this was in 1946. And the war was over, and these were all the waves that came down from Brunswick, Maine, the big air station at Brunswick, Maine, and they closed it up, and so all these waves were sent down to Quonset, and they lived in our barracks and worked at our base.
And this has something to do with San Diego?
Yes, this is San Diego, and Ralph Edwards is, and there's lots of, the waves during the war and after the war were, they were all, you couldn't, when you went up to LA or Hollywood, you couldn't buy a drink. Everybody's buying you drinks, you know. I met Martha Ray's father, you know, and everybody's somebody, you know. And of course you wore your uniform and everybody made a big thing over it. And yeah, it was a whole different world.
Okay. And
oh, that's just a postcard. It shows a wave in the tower.
controlling airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So would you work what would be called local or air traffic? And
Air traffic control.
And then you would have ground control?
Well, no, we worked in the tower, and you get a call on the radio. We had all these different frequencies, and you got the call, and you'd tell them either to land or take off, whatever they wanted, or what the weather was, or if they had an emergency or something. And it was, then we had, once a month, we got what they called Yank Duty, and you had to get in this god-awful truck, had a big dome on it, and drive out to the head of the runway that was the duty runway. And you got out from the driver's place and sat up in this little thing, and you had a very pistol, and you had to give a wave off if somebody was coming in with their wheels up. Or the tower would say, give the F6 on final the wave off. And this time I was sitting there, I couldn't get the full thing to fire. I'm pulling and pulling, wasn't even looking what I was doing, and finally the thing went off, and there's a guy in a Corsair sitting on a taxi strip, and it almost landed in his lap. So that was the end of that. But it was kind of a whole Yank truck with 2 people in it. I guess there was a pilot in there. It was down in Norfolk, got hit by a plane, and they were all killed. So it was kind of scary. I didn't like it. It was painted big checkers, you know, so they'd see it. But still, pilots, you know, I don't know where they have their head when they're supposed to be flying. They don't always look at everything.
Yes, this is true.
Yeah.
Okay. You also brought in a photograph of a very handsome gentleman. Can you tell us who this is?
This is my husband. And
Okay.
it's Ted McCutcheon, and he's a Boise native. Graduated from Boise High in 1938. And he entered the Navy before Pearl Harbor in September of '41. And he was in the invasion of North Africa. He was on a carrier, the Shenango. And before they left Norfolk, he was flying an F-4F. And the controls jammed, and he was headed straight down, nothing could. Anyhow, at 500 feet, he bailed out. And as his chute opened, his feet touched the tops of the trees. But he didn't get hurt. Oh, and the funny thing is that many, many, many years later, we were living here in Boise after he retired, and the phone rang one day, and he was sitting out on the patio, and I answered it, and this man said, "I'm trying to reach Otis McCutcheon." I said, "He's here." And I said, "Who's this calling?" And they told me. And they had found the plane that he had bailed out of back in Norfolk. It had landed in the swamp, and they had never developed it because it was swampy back there. And they found the plane and got the bureau number off it and went to D.C., the Bureau of Aeronautics, and found out who had been flying that plane last. And they got my husband's name, and it took them about 6 months to find him. You know, he'd gotten out of the Navy by that time. But it was a pretty exciting thing, I think, to find the plane that he'd bailed out of in 1942.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and this was about probably 1985 or something like that when we got a call. And then the fellow sent pictures of it. Of course, after he bailed out and went into the swamp, the Navy went out and took everything that was important off the plane. But they never bothered to pull it out, and they left it there. A lot of times during war times, they didn't bother with planes; they just left them wherever they crashed.
Mm-hmm.
But
and then you brought in another photograph. This is Ted with one of the earlier squadrons.
He was made instructor, and this is at Jacksonville, Florida, and this is after he got back from Guadalcanal, where he had shot down 2 Zeros, had 28 bullet holes in his plane, and the tail hook had been partially shot off, and the thing flipped over upside down and gone down the hangar deck.
And we just happen to have a photograph of that, and I'll bring that up.
Yeah, he considered himself.
It
He considered himself pretty lucky, all the things that happened to him. But
yeah. So this happened aboard the aircraft carrier.
The Shenango.
Shenango. So of course this airplane was scrapped.
Yes, they threw it over the side.
Okay. So take us now. You leave the Navy. What do you do now in the civilian world?
Well, I got out of the Navy October 18th, 1951, and I drove back to Patuxent River, Maryland, where my husband was, and I never worked, you know. He was the lieutenant commander. And then we just moved around the country. We went from Patuxent River to Monterey, to line school, Monterey, California. And then our first baby was born in Corona, California. And my husband was on a carrier, the Sicily, over in Japan. That was in 1953. Well, the baby only lived 1 day. And then later, let's see, we went from Monterey to, he went to sea, and then we went to San Francisco. He was at Hunters Point. He was a CO of or exec of a carrier they were putting in mothballs. And then from there we went up to Bremerton, and we were at Bremerton for about 6 months. And then he went down to Miramar, and he was the exec of the forget the name of the squadron. It was VF, what the heck is it? VF-114, and there were F-2Hs, McDonnell Douglas plane, jets. And so they went out to, and then I had a baby girl, and she lived, she was okay. And then that was 1955, and then he went out on the carrier Essex with that squadron, and he was gone for 7 months, something like that. And when he got back, we got sent from San Diego to Key West, Florida. And of course we came by way of Boise, which is his home, and to visit his mother and everybody. And so then we drove back east and visited my family in Philadelphia, and then went down to Key West. Well, we were in Key West when Castro took over. That was exciting. And we were there about 3 years, and we left Key West for Norfolk, Virginia. But we didn't go up the coast from Key West to Norfolk. Oh, my first son, John, was born in Key West in 1958. He weighed 10.6, broke the hospital record. And then we went from Key West to Boise, visit his family, and then back to Norfolk. And in Norfolk, my youngest son was born, and he weighed 10.8. And so then, so I had 4 children, and by then I was 40, and there was no more children. So anyhow, from Norfolk, we went up to New York. We got Navy quarters. I guess my husband stopped in D.C. to visit Frank Church to find out about Navy housing up in New York, because the people up there, they knew the Navy or whoever had to pay whatever they asked because there wasn't any real Navy housing. Well, we took over, the Navy took over the housing at the old Mitchell Air Force Base up on Long Island. And so we got quarters there, very nice quarters, brick house. The place had been empty, the whole base had been empty for about 2 or 3 years, and so there were bushes growing in through the windows. It was pretty wild. But anyhow, it was really nice. We enjoyed it. And he was the regional airspace officer at Kennedy. That was his job. And so from then, and then he finished up and he had gone to Boise Junior College when he got out of high school. And it was just a 2-year college then, and he got out of that. And so in order to make Navy captain, he had to get a complete degree, 2 more years. So he went to C.W. Post College in Long Island there, and I got a business degree. Okay. The Navy or somebody never sent the records. Either the college didn't send the records to the Navy or something, but the Navy never got the fact that he had completed his 4 years to make captain, and he got past it. So anyhow, he had 3 more years in the Navy. He was very, very upset about that, but not much he could do. So then we were sent to Maryland. He was in D.C., he was with the Bureau of Weapons in D.C. for 3 years. So we had our 3 kids, and we spent 3 years there. And he had no weekend duties, night duties, and day duties, nothing. So every weekend, Washington, D.C., we got to see everything. My kids just, John, when he first came out here, he was in 4th or 5th grade, I don't remember, but they're talking about this. Oh, I've been there, I saw that, I've been there. You know, we went everywhere. We got to see, you know, the White House and Smithsonian. We're in and out. We were down to George Washington's home, every place. We got to see, 3 years you can get to see all there is to see in D.C. And so we left there. He retired from the Navy. We went to the big ceremony they had. And so he didn't know where we were going. We didn't know. We thought he wanted to work at Boeing in Seattle. But this was in 1968. But I think they were kind of laying people off at that time. So he ended up staying here in Boise. So we bought a house, and has 2 acres, and so we put in a swimming pool and all that, and our kids were 7, 10, and 13, so it was good. I was glad that they were that age when they came here. I wanted them to marry Idahoans. You know, so many of our friends had kids when they were young, but we were old when we had our kids. So anyhow, our kids did marry Idahoans, and so nobody went off somewhere, except my youngest son now lives in Alaska, but he married a girl he met in junior high, so. But anyhow, Boise's been I wasn't that happy with it when we first came here, because I said, it's too far from the ocean. He said, are you kidding? He said, we can get there just like that. So the first long weekend, kids were off, and I said, let's go to the coast. He said, are you kidding? It takes 3 days to get there. So we didn't get to the ocean very much, but see, back east in Philadelphia, we used to go down to Beach Haven, New Jersey, you know, the whole summer, and the ocean was what I like to swim in, and the Pacific Ocean, of course, is a lot colder. But anyhow, it's all worked out. I've gotten to be in Idaho, and I've been here now almost 38 years.
Mm-hmm. Jenny, what did your experience in the service mean to you throughout your life?
To me, it was the greatest period of my life. And you know, I got another wave, and I got a Boise Valley Waves group started here. We had 26 waves, and all those women, we never had served together. None of us ever knew each other, but we had a unit. Then we met once a month, and those girls just, every one of them said the same thing. They thought the time in the Navy was the greatest they ever had. And I was in longer than most of them. I was in 7.5 years, and most of these waves only put in 2 years. You know, the war was over and they got out. but they all look back on it as being a very good organization. So then, in the meantime, 1986, it's 20 years now, I have belonged to the Idaho Women Veterans Organization. And I have been the membership chairman of that for 20 years. And that's made up of all women, all services. We have Navy, Army, Marine, Coast Guard, Air Force, National Guard, all kinds of people. And we usually have about 60 members, and we meet once a month. And our main purpose is to do things for the women veterans that live at the veterans' home. There's about 10 of them there now. Most of them are in wheelchairs. A lot of them are younger than me, and it makes me feel so happy to still be up and around and moving around. But
and then you also support the Women in Military Service,
yes.
Americans Memorial?
Yes, I was a plank owner for that, yeah, charter member.
Charter member, and you, and that's an awfully nice memorial. And
it is.
A photograph of that.
I
And
don't.
that started in what year?
Well,
Construction, do you remember?
God, I should, because I had to. One of the big things in my life that I knew Ruby Stone, who is a representative in the legislature here in Boise, and she asked me if I would come down and speak to the Joint Finance Committee to see if Idaho, and was one other state, Hawaii, I think, that had not donated any money. See, this memorial was all built with donations. Some states, like Connecticut, twice donated $100,000. Idaho had never donated anything. So Ruby Stone asked me if I would come down to the legislature and speak to the Joint Finance Committee and see if they would donate something. We were just asking for $1 for each woman veteran in Idaho, which was $5,000. Just asking for $5,000. So I stood there and said what I had to say and told them, I said, the people that go back to the memorial, it was already built and dedicated at that time. And I said, they're very embarrassed to find out that Idaho has never donated 1 cent. I said, they are very embarrassed about that. And I think we should get some money for it. So they did. They finally donated $7,000. So then Kemp Thorne had us all in his office, us waves, everybody, while he signed the thing.
Very good.
Yeah, so our state did donate.
Very good.
Yeah, but Idaho has always been pretty cheap on stuff. More I find out about that. But they have very high taxes.
Well, Jenny, is there anything that we have not covered during this interview that you would like to add? Or?
Well, I realized the waves that went in, we were releasing a sailor for active duty for out in the ocean somewhere on a ship or something. And a lot of the men, the sailors, resented that because, oh God, there goes my job here, a shore duty job. They had to go to sea. And we went through quite, now the women in the military now can do all kinds of things. My gosh, they're flying airplanes off carriers, and, you know, doing all kinds of things that we weren't even allowed to even think of. They gave us tests a lot when I was in, and I remember one time they called me into the assistant operations officer's office, and they said, well, Jenny, your test results are so good that if you were a male, you could take flight training. I said, well, that's great, you know. Well, the chief in charge of the tower heard that. He was very upset about it, and he didn't want me even working there anymore. So he did everything. He made out the duty list, and he says, okay, Webb, he says, you got to swab the men's bunk room. I said, are you kidding? So I went down to the operations officer. I said, well, I just found the duty list, and they've got me down to swab the men's bunk room. I said, the men don't swab the women's bunk room. Why should I? I'm first class. Why should I be swabbing a men's bunk room? Oh, no. So this chief was just out to give me a bad time. So that's when I was in charge of the operations dispatch, where everything was fine. But you did put up with a lot of guff from the sailors that resented you because, you know, we didn't get any kind of special privileges, that they just didn't like us being there because to them, we were taking the job from them. And then when the war was over and they were shorthanded, they had this chief that gave me such a bad time. He was the chief metalsmith. He didn't know anything about flying, planes, anything. And some of the things they do was so stupid, you know. Like when the radio went out, they didn't know what to do, and I knew exactly what to do. I'd been in the tower for so many years, you know. And they just, it was a fight the whole time, really. But anyhow, it all worked out. To me, I had a great time in the Navy, and everybody I know that was in the service, this Women Veterans Organization I belong to, as I say, we've got from all services. And every one of them, those women just really relished the time that they had served, you know. It's a good feeling, you know. You can hold your head up. And we'll all probably end up living at the veterans' home in a wheelchair. But, you know, what else?
Well, Jenny, thank you for coming in today. It was a privilege and a pleasure.
It's probably different.
To interview you. And I want to thank you for your service to your country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Very good.
I feel I did something.
You did.